A luxury Mercedes explodes in a fiery roar, its driver trapped as flames close in. An Uber driver leaps into the chaos, tearing through smoke to save him just as the car detonates. Who is this hero risking it all? What if he's a legend in disguise? Where are you watching from today? I'm so glad you're here. Would you run into the fire? Comment 1 or freeze. Comment 2. If bravery and redemption ignite you, subscribe to Motivation for Success. Now, dive into a night where courage burned arrogance to ash. The night was a suffocating shroud, a starless void pressing down on Los Angeles with a weight that seemed to crush the city's restless hum, and Keanu Reeves, a name that echoes through the world like a whispered hymn of grace, chose to flee the spotlight's hollow glare for a jagged shard of raw, unpolished truth. To millions, he was humility's rare flame, a man whose heart glowed with a quiet, fierce light, a beacon in a storm of cold indifference so pure it could pierce the soul with its tenderness. But on March 17, 2025, after a charity marathon that left him hollow hours of giving until his spirit bled dry, his bones trembling with exhaustion, he craved the wild, unfiltered pulse of life, the ache of ordinary struggles that thrummed beneath the surface. This wasn't a whim, it was a descent into the marrow of existence, a desperate plunge to feel the heartbeat of humanity, to touch its tender wounds and searing hopes, all to fuel a role that demanded he spill his own grief onto the screen, a film that would beg a fractured world to hold kindness like a fragile, dying child. Wrapped in a dark, threadbare jacket, a cap yanked low over eyes carved with decades of silent scars, he sank into a battered black Toyota Prius, a dented, pitiful shell for a man who'd carried the dreams of nations and melted into the city's throbbing veins, a ghost on wheels, his chest tight with a longing he couldn't voice, a hunger to vanish into the shadows yet burn with purpose. Los Angeles sprawled before him like a wounded giant, its neon lights flickering with desperate, fragile dreams, its shadows thick with the cries of the unseen, the forgotten. Keanu gripped the wheel, his breath a shallow prayer, fingers tracing the worn, cracked leather as if it could steady him against the tide of memories that surged, unbidden memories of loss, of nights spent staring into the dark, of a life shaped by giving when he had so little left to offer. The city's pulse beat around him, cars honking, streetlights casting fleeting glows across his face, voices rising and falling in a distant, chaotic symphony, and he navigated its arteries with a quiet precision, a man who'd mastered the art of wearing anonymity like armor. The dashboard clock ticked past midnight, its red digits glowing like embers in the gloom, when a sharp ping shattered the silence, a ride request from Beverly Hills, where wealth draped the air like a velvet noose, strangling the night with its excess. The Prius rolled forward, its engine a low, weary hum, toward a mansion that loomed like a dictator's citadel, its marble face gleaming cold and cruel beneath the moon's pale, judgmental stare. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine and money, a perfume that masked a deeper rot, and Keanu's hands tightened on the wheel, a flicker of unease stirring in his gut, a premonition of the storm brewing ahead. Out stepped Mark Taylor, a titan of commerce whose name was a blade whispered in awe and dread, a man who'd forged his empire by crushing dreams beneath his polished heels, his cruelty a crown he wore with savage, unrelenting pride. His suit was a weapon, sharp and merciless, clinging to his frame like a predator's hide. His Rolex flashed like a warlord's banner, a taunt to the night that dared anyone to challenge his reign. His hair, streaked with gray, was slicked back, a mark of battles won through ruthless ambition, and his eyes, icy and ravenous, swept over the Prius with a disgust so palpable it seemed to thicken the air. The sneer that twisted his lips was a wound, a deliberate, searing gash carved into the silence before he even spoke, and Keanu felt it, a chill that sank into his bones, a harbinger of the venom to come, a shadow of the hate he'd faced too many times before. Mark sank into the back seat like a conqueror forced into filth, his weight pressing into the worn upholstery with a disdain that radiated like heat, turning the air sour with his loathing. "This is Uber now," he hissed, his voice a venomous lash that whipped through the stillness, dripping with acid intent on burning everything it touched. This stinking, pathetic heap. It's a slap to my face, an insult to my very existence. Keanu's chest clenched, a sharp, jagged pang of hurt blooming beneath his ribs, a wound that throbbed with every syllable, a familiar ache he'd buried under years of quiet endurance. His hand stayed steady, gripping the wheel like a lifeline, but inside, he felt the sting, a piercing echo of judgment, of being less than human, a scar reopened by this man's scorn. "It's clean, sir," he murmured, his voice trembling with a fragile calm, a thread of warmth fraying against the icy assault, barely holding back the tempest roiling within. "You'll ride safe, I swear it on everything I am." Mark's laugh was a brutal, guttural snarl, a beast baring its teeth, sharp enough to draw blood as it echoed through the car. "Safe? This is a humiliation, a stain on my name. Floor it, I'm late, and I won't waste another breath in this disgrace." The words were a fist, slamming down with the weight of entitlement, a command that roared with the arrogance of a man who'd never tasted want, and Keanu's throat burned, a scalding ache rising like bile, but he pressed the gas, burying the pain beneath the engine's faltering hum, his breath hitching as he fought to keep himself whole. The miles unfurled in a storm of Mark's hatred, his voice a relentless torrent of poison that flooded the car with its festering bile, each word a fresh assault on Keanu's fragile silence. "You drivers," he growled, leaning forward, his breath hot and rancid with disdain, pressing against Keanu's neck like a blade poised to strike, "worthless, groveling in the dirt like worms. No spine, no fire, just leeches sucking the world dry with your miserable, ambitionless lives." Each syllable was a sledgehammer, smashing against Keanu's heart, splintering the quiet armor he'd forged through years of grief for a sister lost to time, a love buried beneath the weight of years, a life spent giving when his own well had run dry. He felt at every barb a fresh cut, every sneer a bruise that pulsed with the agony of being stripped bare, reduced to nothing in this man's cruel, unseeing eyes, and it tore him open, a wound that wept silently, a gash that bled with the weight of every insult he'd ever swallowed, every moment he'd chosen silence over rage. Inside, a maelstrom churned, fury, yes, searing and wild, a fire that clawed at his restraint, begging to erupt, but beneath it, a deeper, more shattering sorrow, a grief for the hardness of a soul so lost, so blind, a man who traded his humanity for a throne of gold and scorn. His knuckles blanched white, his jaw locked tight, teeth grinding against the urge to scream, but he drove on, a lighthouse trembling in a hurricane, refusing to let the darkness claim him, his breath a ragged stutter as he clung to the road ahead, a lifeline in the chaos. The Prius hung through the night, a fragile vessel adrift in a sea of rage, its tires whispering against the asphalt as the city blurred past neon signs casting fleeting, ghostly glows across Keanu's face, illuminating the lines etched by time and pain, the shadows of battles fought in silence. He thought of the role awaiting him, the film that would demand he bear this very ache, this quiet resilience, and it steadied him, a faint thread of purpose weaving through the storm. Mark's tirade pressed on, relentless, a litany of insults that painted drivers as subhuman, ambitionless, a blight on his pristine world. "You're nothing," he spat, voice thick with the thrill of domination, leaning closer, his words a hot breath against Keanu's ear, "a speck under my heel, a waste of air, a stain I'd wipe away if I could." Keanu's hands trembled, a faint quiver betraying the calm he clung to, and he saw flashes of his own past moments of loss, of being dismissed as less than, of standing alone against a world that didn't care. But he'd survived, hadn't he? He'd built something from the ashes, a life of giving, of quiet strength, and this man's words couldn't undo that. Not tonight. Not ever. Yet the weight pressed harder, each insult a stone piling onto his chest, and he breathed through it, a silent vow to endure, to rise above, even as his heart ached with the effort. Then the night split open with a violence that silenced even Mark's venom, a rupture that tore through the fragile thread of their journey like a blade through flesh. Ahead, a luxury Mercedes lay in ruins, a twisted corpse of steel and glass, its once proud frame mangled into a grotesque parody of itself, smoke pouring from its guts like a death rattle, thick and black against the sky. Flames danced, wild and ravenous, licking at the edges with a hunger that growled low and deep, as a raw, guttural moan clawed its way from the wreckage. A man, crushed beneath the dashboard, his life leaking out in shallow, desperate gasps, blood pooling beneath him like a dark, shimmering mirror reflecting the night's cruelty. The road was a graveyard, onlookers frozen in a tableau of horror, their eyes wide with terror, their cowardice a stench that mingled with the smoke, their hands useless at their sides as they watched a life slip away. Keanu's foot lifted from the pedal, his heart slamming against his chest with a force that threatened to crack his ribs, a primal, anguished scream pulling him toward that dying sound, a call that pierced his soul and demanded he answer. Mark's voice erupted behind him, a feral bellow that shook the car's frail frame, raw with panic and fury, spit flying from his lips as he pounded the seat. "Don't you stop!" he roared, his face contorted into a mask of desperation and entitlement, his voice cracking with the fear he refused to name. "It's not our war, I'm late, damn you, keep going. Leave him to die." The command was a plea, a tyrant unraveling at the edges, but Keanu turned, his eyes blazing with a fire that could melt mountains, a light born of every loss he'd endured, every tear he'd shed in silence, and his voice thundered, raw and unyielding, a sound that split the night like a crack of thunder. "Get out or stay," he roared, each word a seismic vow, a promise carved in blood and bone, "but I won't let him burn alone, I can't, not when I can save him." Mark recoiled, a god struck down, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes wide with shock, as Keanu tore the door open and ran with the desperation of a man who'd lost too much, who'd sworn in the quiet of countless lonely nights that he'd never let another soul slip away if he could hold them back from the abyss. The air was a furnace, a choking haze of gasoline and despair, thick with the reek of burning rubber and melting steel, as Keanu reached the wreck, his lungs searing with every ragged breath, his eyes stinging from the smoke that blurred the world into a nightmare of shadow and flame. The driver's face was a shattered relic, blood streaming like rivers down his cheeks, eyes dimming in a final, broken plea for mercy, his hands twitching weakly against the wreckage that entombed him, a faint tremble of life clinging to the edge, and Keanu's soul howled, a soundless cry that tore through him, a grief and a fury so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. His hands, shaking with a rage born of love, seized the mangled door, tearing at it with a strength that erupted from the deepest part of him, a primal scream of defiance against the void that had taken so much already: his family, his peace, his moments of joy stolen by time. Metal shrieked, bending and groaning under his relentless will, jagged edges slicing into his palms, blood mixing with sweat as he pulled, muscles straining until they burned, veins bulging in his neck, his breath a series of gasps that tore from his chest. The crowd's breath caught, a collective sob rising from their throats as he dragged the man free, his arms buckling under the dead weight, his lungs burning with smoke and tears, his knees hitting the asphalt with a crack as he pulled the stranger clear, the heat licking at his back like a living thing. The car exploded, a cataclysmic blast of fire and sound that shook the ground beneath him, a monstrous roar that clawed at his spine, scorching his flesh through the jacket, singeing his hair, the force throwing him forward as he shielded the man with his body. He fell, cradling the stranger against his chest, sobs wrenching from his throat, not for the pain that racked his frame, not for the burns that blistered his skin, but for the unbearable, radiant beauty of a life clawed back from the brink, a victory that felt like a wound and a miracle all at once, a moment that broke him open and stitched him back together in the same breath. Mark watched from the Prius, his arrogance crumbling into ash, his heart pounding with a terror that clawed at his throat, the sight a blade that sliced through his soul, leaving him bleeding and raw, his hands trembling as the world he'd built began to collapse around him. The man he'd mocked, the driver he'd deemed worthless, was a storm of courage and compassion, a force so pure it dwarfed him, exposed him as the hollow shell he'd become. His breath came in shallow gasps, his Rolex glinting dully now, a relic of a power that meant nothing in the face of this man who'd thrown himself into fire while Mark sat, safe and venomous, in his gilded cage. The crowd surged forward, some weeping openly, others shouting, their phones raised to capture the moment, but Mark sat frozen, his eyes locked on Keanu, his mind a chaos of disbelief and dread, his chest tightening with a shame he couldn't name. Sirens wailed, piercing the chaos with their mournful cry, and flashing lights flooded the night in a surreal, blinding glow as rescuers descended like harbingers of salvation, their voices sharp and urgent against the crackle of dying flames. A young officer, barely more than a boy, dropped to his knees beside Keanu, his face streaked with soot and awe, his voice cracking with reverence and tears as he took in the soot-streaked figure before him, bloodied hands still cradling the stranger. "Mr. Reeves?" He choked out, hands trembling as he reached toward the man he'd only ever known as a distant icon, a hero made flesh in this moment of ruin. "Your God, it's an honor to stand in your shadow." The name was a thunderbolt, a revelation that shattered Mark's world into jagged fragments, the sound reverberating through the smoke and ruin like a judgment. His breath stopped, his chest caved in like a house of cards. Keanu Reeves, the man he'd flayed alive with his tongue, the vermin he'd cursed and mocked, was a titan of compassion, a soul whose every heartbeat was a gift to a world that didn't deserve him, a man who'd walked through fire while Mark spat venom from the safety of his throne. Guilt crashed over him, a molten tsunami of shame that burned hotter than the flames, drowning him in the wreckage of his own hubris, his Rolex a cold, useless shackle on a wrist that shook with the weight of his sins, his empire revealed as a lie built on the backs of those he deemed beneath him. Keanu staggered back to the car, soot-blackened and weary, his eyes red with unshed grief and a fire that refused to die, his presence a quiet apocalypse that burned the air with its intensity. His jacket hung in tatters, patches of fabric melted into his skin, his hands raw and trembling from the effort of tearing metal apart, blood dripping from his fingers onto the pavement, but he carried himself with a grace that defied the pain. A man who'd faced hell and emerged whole, scarred but unbroken, his breath a labored rasp that spoke of battles fought and won. Mark's voice broke, a pitiful, keening wail that barely escaped his throat, raw with a regret that clawed at his insides like a trapped animal. "Mr. Reeves, I'm so sorry," he stammered, the words a cry torn from a throat hoarse with shame, a confession that felt too small, too late, as he shrank into the seat, his once imposing frame reduced to a trembling husk, a giant felled by the weight of his own filth. Keanu stopped, his gaze soft but piercing, a blade of mercy that cut deeper than any wrath could, and his words fell like rain on a scorched, barren earth, gentle yet heavy with a truth that seared. "No harm done," he whispered, his voice trembling with a grace Mark couldn't fathom, a tenderness that broke him anew, each syllable a mirror reflecting the ugliness he'd nurtured, the man he'd become. "But maybe now you'll feel it. Respect isn't power, isn't gold, isn't the throne you sit on. It's this." He pressed a hand to his chest, where his heart thundered with a love too vast, too fierce to contain, a rhythm that had driven him into fire and back again, and the gesture was a wound, a light that seared Mark's darkness away, leaving him exposed, raw, and trembling, a man stripped bare by the kindness he'd scorned. The silence that followed was a deafening abyss, a void that roared with the echoes of what had been, a stillness so profound it seemed to swallow the city's distant hum, leaving only the sound of Mark's shallow, shuddering breaths. He sat, shattered, his Rolex a dead weight on his wrist, its gleam dulled by the soot that clung to his hands, every venomous word he'd spat replaying in his mind like a whip turned inward, flaying him to the bone, peeling back the layers of a man he no longer recognized. Keanu's face scarred, radiant, etched with the pain of 1,000 unseen battles burned into him, a man who'd borne his hate with a grace that defied comprehension, who'd thrown his life into fire for a stranger's breath while Mark wallowed in the rot of his own making, a king of nothing reigning over a kingdom of ash. The ride ended, but the torment didn't. Mark stumbled out of the Prius, his legs unsteady beneath him, tears streaming down a face twisted with anguish, the city's lights blurring into a haze around him as he stood alone on the sidewalk, the air thick with the scent of ash and gasoline and something heavier, something that tasted like redemption, bitter and sweet on his tongue. He watched as Keanu drove away, a silhouette of quiet, unyielding strength fading into the dark, the Prius's taillights glowing like twin embers in the night, and the sight pierced him, a final blow that cracked his chest wide open, spilling everything he'd held inside: pride, rage, fear onto the pavement in a flood of silent, wrenching sobs. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his hands clawing at the asphalt as the tears came harder, not for what he'd lost, not for the empire that now felt like a lie, but for what he might become: a man humbled, a soul clawing toward light, born anew in the ashes of a night that would haunt him, heal him, forever. The city swallowed Keanu's Prius into its shadowed depths, the taillights flickering like the last breaths of a fading star, leaving Mark crumpled on the cold, unyielding pavement, a king dethroned, his empire of arrogance reduced to dust in the wake of a single, blazing act of humanity. The night pressed in, heavy with the weight of what had transpired, the air still thick with the acrid tang of smoke and the faint, lingering echo of a stranger's life pulled back from the abyss. Mark's sobs tore through the silence, raw and jagged, a sound that seemed to claw its way out of a soul laid bare, each tear a shard of the man he'd been, dissolving into the earth beneath him. Around him, the world moved on, cars hummed past, distant laughter drifted from unseen corners, but he was alone, suspended in a moment that had stripped him to his core, a man who'd wielded power like a blade now trembling under the weight of a kindness he couldn't comprehend. Keanu was gone, a quiet legend vanishing into the dark, but his presence lingered like a flame that refused to die, searing Mark's conscience with a truth he could no longer deny. True strength wasn't in domination, wasn't in wealth or scorn, it was in the courage to run toward the fire when everyone else stood still, in the grace to forgive when hate had carved its mark. The stranger Keanu had saved lay in the arms of medics, his chest rising and falling with fragile, precious breaths, a life reclaimed from the jaws of death by a man who'd asked nothing in return. The crowd dispersed, their whispers carrying fragments of awe and disbelief. Did you see him? It was Keanu Reeves, but the story wasn't theirs to hold, it was Mark's, a wound and a gift that would haunt his every step, a mirror he'd never escape. He rose, unsteady, his suit stained with soot and shame, his Rolex dangling like a shackle he no longer had the strength to bear, and he walked into the night, a hollow shell of the titan he'd been, yet somehow fuller, cracked open, bleeding, but alive in a way he hadn't been before. The city loomed around him, vast and indifferent, but within him burned a flicker of something new, something tender and terrifying, the seed of redemption, planted in the ashes of his pride, watered by the tears of a night that had broken him to build him anew. And what of us, watching from the edges of this tale? What does it stir in you, this collision of courage and cruelty, this dance of shadows and light? That Mercedes Inferno wasn't just a car ablaze, it was a crucible, burning away the lies we tell ourselves about worth, about power, about who we choose to be when the flames rise. Keanu, a legend in disguise, didn't hesitate. He ran into the chaos, hands bleeding, heart wide open, while Mark, a titan of wealth, sat paralyzed by his own venom. The lesson cuts deep: we're not defined by what we have, but by what we give, by the moments we choose to act, to feel, to fight for someone else's breath. So I ask you, from wherever you're watching today, would you run into the fire? Comment 1, or freeze in its glare? Comment 2. What would you risk to save a stranger, to save yourself? This story's embers still glow, and I'm so grateful you're here to feel their warmth with me. If bravery and redemption set your soul alight, subscribe to Motivation for Success, hit that button, join this journey, because we've got more tales like this waiting to ignite your spirit. Drop your thoughts below, let's keep this fire burning, and I'll see you in the next video with stories that'll shake you, lift you, and leave you hungry for more. Until then, carry this with you: when the flames come, who will you be?